Attention.
All right. Hello. We are three PhD students from the University of Texas at Dallas, and we are going to be presenting a roundtable panel, Unapologetically Inclusive in an Unapologetically Alienated Academia. So I will hand it over to Alana, who is going to go first. Alana?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alana King, and I am currently finishing up my PhD in literature. Fingers crossed, I will be done in December. And today I will be talking to you about how I've created more inclusive read and world literature sections. So, the title of my part of this panel is A Little Bit Goes a Long Way. And so, yes, it is from a Jessica Simpson song, and I know it's very weird for something pediological based to be from Jessica Simpson, but basically the lyrics of just a little bit of here and there creates a more inclusive environment, at least for me. And so when I was planning on creating these red classes and then creating these world lit classes, this is one of the songs that kind of came to mind, and one of the quotes that came to mind, like what are little things that I can do to make this a better experience for everyone involved. And so Jessica Simpson and others kind of helped me see if I just did things here and there, that would end up working out best for everyone. So for 7 semesters, I was a red instructor at UT Dallas, and having this time each semester, it allowed me to better fine tune the resources and examples that I use to teach, and how the assignments that I gave to students would look like to best suit them. And this really started in the first week. So some of the first week activities that I had them do was an introductory discussion post, and I asked them about one thing I asked them about is like, how long have you been at UTD? What's your major, and what do you hope to do after you graduate? And then every red section has their students doing a diagnostic essay, either in the first class or the first week of classes. And so the prompt that I would give to them would be to discuss an issue or cause that you are passionate about. And from these first assignments, I was able to gauge what my students' majors were, what their interests are, what their passions were, and kind of go from there. Semester long activities that I did to kind of help me better get to know my students included free writing prompts that happened at the beginning of each face to face meeting. They had in class activities, and they were evaluating different forms of rhetoric, textbook assignments that allowed students to find their own pieces of rhetoric to complete that assignment instead of just assigning them to read this person or read that person. They got to choose what they wanted to do based on their own interest in academic majors. And then the 3 major essays for each semester allowed them to focus on topics that they were interested in instead of being assigned that they had to do this particular piece and analyze it, or only have a choice of a few pieces that are usually not as inclusive. So using the different information, I kind of, as Jessica Simpson said, a little bit goes a long way. And in this, I've seen time and time again, just based on student feedback, both at the end of the semester and after class as well. Students are already going to be assigned to analyze and evaluate a variety of sources throughout the semester in red regardless. So taking a little bit of time and getting a little bit of information about my students gave me the opportunity to better reach them. And this allowed me to provide more relevant examples that they can connect with, instead of me just trying to choose on my own what I think that they should analyze or what I think that they should focus on. The overall lesson outline from semester to semester never had to change, but as long as the examples that I used during lecture time and other periods of class cater to particular sections breakdown of students, taking that little bit of time greatly increased student participation and interest. during conversations during the semester or during their end of semester feedback, as I mentioned, students mentioned that they did not necessarily enjoy reading, writing, or other parts of rhetoric, and also would state that they only enrolled in the class because there was a graduation requirement. But they also noted that my going through and kind of tailoring the class towards them allowed them to feel safe, included, more welcomed. Overall, they were more interested in rhetoric in general because they were able to better understand how they would use the skills that I was teaching them in their other classes and in their job fields. They also said that they felt better prepared for upcoming coursework, internships, and potential postgraduate studies. I believe that this happened because, at least in part, due to my being intentional in what I assigned them to do, how I chose to teach, and how I focused on creating a welcoming and inclusive environment where students could feel safe while learning. So, one of the things I did starting in the first semester was I created a flipped classroom. I did not know that this was actually the term at the time. I just thought if it was focused more on what they would do instead of me just lecturing for 50 minutes 3 times a week or 80 minutes 2 times a week, they would get more out of it. And part of that, I did that because of how when I was a student in these classes, I did not do as well in lecture based classes as I did in classes where I was able to actually do hands on experiences and hands on learning. So I kind of tailored my class to where it better fit me, but I did not just focus on my own learning style. I tried to learn other people's learning styles and see what worked for them. So kind of the way that the class broke down after their free writing in the face-to-face sections, there was a small period of time for direct instruction, which is the I do portion. And this is mainly just defining the key terms and showing a couple of examples of what we'd be focusing on that day or what we'd be focusing on that particular part of the unit. This then moved to a we do full class inquiry and exploration period. And so for the VD portion, we would have full class analysis and answering questions about the examples provided. And so early on in the semester, they learned different questions that you should ask while trying to evaluate a source, such as making sure you knew who the source was, what the title of the source was, and finding different parts about it, like what kind of, was it persuasive, was it expository, was it trying to persuade you to do something? Was it just trying to teach you more information about something? Was it trying to compel you to feel a certain way about something? So they learned these different questions at the very beginning of the semester, and then they implement it throughout the semester during their analysis of the different sources. And after a full class exploration, there is the they do portion, and this constituted independent or partner or group work. They analyzed and answered questions about the examples that they chose to search for depending on what the topic was. I mentioned catering to different different learning styles as a way I was teaching face-to-face sections and kind of breaking it down into the 7 different learning styles. I tried to make sure to reach as many learners as I could, and that was another way that I tried to make my class as inclusive as possible by making sure that everybody was being reached. So, for example, throughout the semester, they did have reading assignments as well as brief textbook assignments that they did for homework. And this is geared towards interpersonal learners who learn better on their own, but also lecturing with a PowerPoint, and that included definitions of terms, different examples. That was reaching my auditory learners, my verbal learners, as well as my visual learners, because they were able to hear what I was saying. They were able to see it written on the PowerPoint, and they were able to have visual examples of what I was talking about at the time. So that hit 3 different learning styles right there. For independent or group work, you had intrapersonal. For those who weren't necessarily comfortable in working with others, they were able to work on their own. But you also had the interpersonal or social aspect for those who wanted to partner up or divvy things up into groups. And so they learned how to better work with one another as well. My kinesthetic learners were able to have hands on learning as they did these different examples. They were able to kind of do these different projects and do these different assignments that allowed them to really implement what they were learning in a physical format as well. So as I said, anthological, um, tried my best to do this in Intro to Red, but because it involved in analyzing written, verbal, and visual rhetoric, this allowed logical learners to thrive because students learn how to evaluate through an objective lens, sometimes for the first time. So trying to make things more inclusive based on learning styles was another little bit that I tried to do as I went along this semester to try to reach as many people as I could. So a flipped classroom is one where, quote, class becomes the place to work through problems, advance concepts, and engage in collaborative learning. And I did try to implement this into each red section that I taught. This was more this was a lot easier to do as a face-to-face instructor when you actually have everybody there at the given time and we're able to work with one another each class setting. And along with that, making sure to have examples that covered computer science, business, and medical related topics, as these were always the top three majors of my students. But I also wanted to make sure to add in examples for other majors such as psychology, criminology, speech pathology, depending on what students were majoring in what field in a particular semester. This did change out from one semester to the next, so a little bit of time just tuning the different examples really helped out with that. And I also tried to make sure to work with um, a various a various amount of sources from other countries to just add an international appeal to everything and not just have everything US centered. Also try to have examples of non-heterosexual and non-cisgendered creators in each class as well to make it more inclusive. And so to not just have the same people doing the same things, but to have a worldwide focus, a globalized focus, as well as a non-hetero, non-cis focus as well. I did this both in the we do portion and then allowed them to find their own examples in the they do portion. And so I was able to make sure to have a more inclusive, a more diverse array of assignments and projects based on this. Things, of course, were quite different after COVID hit, but this is how I was able to go about things while I taught in-person classes. After COVID hit, things like working with partners and working in groups became a lot more difficult because I had several students move back to their home countries in March 2020. And so as that semester kind of was broken down in half, I ended up having students coming from 4 different continents and several different time zones, so trying to figure out a way to work with students and their different technological abilities after they moved was a lot more difficult. And so things did become more intrapersonal, where you had a lot more independent work that they were able to do instead of being able to work with groups. But I will say a couple of things that I was able to move over from face to face to online included different assignments that allowed them to see different forms of written, verbal, and visual rhetoric that focus on drug prevention, which was a lesson that I did in a face-to-face setting. I was able to transform that into an online setting, as I was also able to have them view a variety of short films in what I like to call the Red 1302 International Film Festival. And so they were able to do this on their own instead of doing this as a class as we did it in person. But I was able to kind of tweak enough to transform our face-to-face meetings into this is what you'll be doing online this week for your in-class activities. So I was able to do that for the rest of the time I taught rhetoric. This spring, I was moved from the rhetoric classroom to the lit classroom, and I was given my first section of masterpieces of world literature. So this being the first semester that I taught this class, I was kind of given it not too far in advance, so I really had to work hard to try to figure out ways to be intentional and inclusive within this environment like I was for Red. However, we actually have more leeway and more freedom as we plan our lit courses because we can determine what textbooks we'll have our students reading from, what pieces we assign, and the different assignments and assessments instead of most of that being told to us by our vet supervisors. So this was quite refreshing, but at first it was also quite daunting until I was able to really figure out how to be more intentional and inclusive with this. And so some of the ways I was able to do this, even though we are online and in the asynchronous section, one thing I did was just to make sure that every assignment's instructions were available the first day. And this is to cater for those who like to work ahead and also to let everybody else know what time to, and how to schedule everything, both internet wise and time wise, because I still do have several students who are out of the country with different technological abilities as they would have if they were here at UTD. I provide interpersonal learning opportunities via the weekly discussion board. And for this, a few students are tasked with creating two open-ended questions for their classmates to answer, and then students answer these questions and respond to their classmates. So this provides a weekly opportunity for them to discuss the week's readings with one another. Intrapersonal learning opportunities are via the blog posts because they have one blog that they write each week about the week's assigned pieces, and then they also have a few individual assignments that they must do on their own. Instead of doing mini lectures based on the historical time that the class takes place in, which is 1900 to the present, I provided relevant crash course videos to introduce students to the time period. And this is for my auditory, verbal, and visual learners, as they were able to watch the videos and get a better sense of the time period they would be reading about and some of the different people who made that time period as important as it was. My kinesthetic learners have the opportunity to complete a creative final project, and some of the options that they have, they can create a BuzzFeed quiz about the characters, works, or authors they encountered during the semester, or they can create another endeavor such as a short story or a series of poems based on the works that they read. And this allows them to dive deeper into the pieces of their choice and creating a hands-on physical product of what they've learned. In addition to making sure that my different learners are being catered to, I was also intentional about assigning a majority of pieces from non-Western and non-white writers. So out of the 13 weeks that they are assigned something to read, 7 of those 13 weeks have writers specifically from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. 3 of those weeks have writers from the Americas, but a majority of these writers are either women and or writers of color. And then 1 week from the European side of things is dedicated to Holocaust survivors as well as those who survived the Soviet Union's different purges and different things that they had to go through when Joseph Stalin was in charge. So while the literary contributions of European and European descending writers are vast and have a lot to offer, they often overshadow writers from other places such as Central and South America, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And so one way I was able to make my course more inclusive was to make sure to get these otherwise overshadowed writers a chance to be read and learn from. And I made my class look as diverse as my students are, as we do have students from several different countries. As UT Dallas, it caters towards international students as well as first generation Americans. So last but not least, how does intentional inclusivity dismantle racism? I do want to be clear about one thing, that that's not my intended goal of dismantling racism or any other forms of isms that continue to plague our society. As a woman of color, I don't necessarily feel like it is my job to do this because I did not build these walls, and I do not continue to benefit from these walls and from these forms of privilege that I am not a part of. However, I do want to say that I do intentionally plan my lessons, assignments, and assessments with a more feasible and measurable goal in mind. And I do try to make sure that students are equipped with different skills that are necessary to do the work of dismantling racism and other isms that come around. I want to make sure that they leave my class with a better ability to effectively communicate and making sure that the sources that they choose to consume are more objective. They're able to see the different biases and the subjectivity in them better once they leave as well. So The overall goal is not necessarily to make sure I instill in them that it's their job to dismantle racism. I just want to give them the tools necessary to not only dismantle it, but to also create a new, improved, and more inclusive replacement. I don't necessarily put this onus on them because, as I mentioned, I do have several international students and first generation students, and they are not the cause of these issues either. So I do want to make sure I keep that in mind, but I want to make sure that everybody leaves my class, no matter if they were born here or if they came over as a child or if they just happen to be here for their college experience. I do want to make sure that they are able to have the skills and tools needed to be a part of the change and to be a part of a positive future and not necessarily a part of the present issues. I do hope that equipping them via my instructional methods do help them out, and I will continue to do what I can as a red lit instructor or as I move on from UT Dallas as an English instructor to see what I can do to truly help them dismantle racism and the other isms and create a more inclusive academia. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so I am next. Um, so mine is called Rap Rhetoric and Empathy, Confronting Racism in Academia. Um, whew, so I'm going to tell you a little story first. August 18th, 2020, classes begin. Every morning, as usual, students are talking to their friends before we start. This semester, however, the talk is different. There's a noticeably political slant to their conversations. Amid talk of homecoming and dates, I hear the words COVID, greenhouse gases, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. Some discuss Supreme Court filings while others talk about the latest presidential scandal. And every morning, 1 minute to class time, while most of my students talk quietly to their friends, one particular student slams open the door and shouts, DJT! Chatter dies. Other students shift awkwardly in their seat. The young man makes his way to his seat, high-fiving his friends, nodding at girls, and I stand to begin our lesson. So currently, I teach writing classes at two different schools. One is UT Dallas, where Alana was talking about, which is really incredibly diverse. The undergraduate population is only 28% white at University of Texas at Dallas. The other school that I teach at is a majority white, fairly affluent high school, and I teach dual credit classes. So I teach college classes for high school students. As a writing teacher, I am not explicitly tasked with addressing race and racism, but I do feel like it is my job as someone charged with improving student communication skills to engage students in critical thinking about the world around them. And in that world, currently and for the foreseeable future, everything relates back to race in some way. Uh, of course, a lot of my white students don't really see or understand that link back to race. They are stuck in that white is the norm mindset and don't really understand or agree that that mindset needs to change. They encounter arguments like Black Lives Matter and take it to mean Black Lives Matter more instead of Black Lives also matter. Um, so, as a white teacher and scholar, and as a concerned human, I think it is incumbent upon me to use my platform as a teacher to help my students grapple with the difficult topics, namely race, in their everyday lives. So, to help students analyze and be critically aware citizens, I approach them and require them to approach each other with empathy. In my majority white classes, as well as in my mixed race classes, this approach has served me and my students well. I begin by approaching students as my equals, using methods teachers call reality pedagogy and process pedagogy. Um, so, one aspect of reality pedagogy is cosmopolitanism, which is a focus on developing deep connections with students across racial, ethnic, linguistic, and gender categories so they can get the most from their classroom experience. Using empathy and treating students as the authority of their own experiences is the basis for this. By bringing student experience to the forefront of the writing classroom, I am showing them that their knowledge and experience are important, and academically important as well, not just important to them as people. This is usually a novel experience for them. They're used to being talked down to, looked down to. They're used to being subordinate in the classroom. But how are they supposed to learn, especially something as personal as critical thinking, if they are not included in that learning process? So the other thing that I use is process pedagogy, which calls for bringing student writing and experiences into the classroom as the text of the classroom. So instead of focusing on the essay, that end product, we focus on the process of writing and the process of critical thinking. We begin with invention, or coming up with what to write, which is not as simple as just brainstorming or organizing your ideas. Invention begins with a premise. It doesn't just come from a vacuum. We can't generate ideas in a vacuum. So we have to start with something, and I can either give them a prompt, and I hate to do that, or um, they can find an idea by relating something to their other ideas. Um, So instead of giving them a prompt, uh, I bring in examples, texts that we analyze in class and discuss, and then I let them choose what to write about. Much like Alana was saying, in terms of what do we analyze. So for me, one of the first texts that I bring into the classroom is Macklemore's song "White Privilege 2." I first taught this song as a new teacher in 2015. Um, and I was kind of hesitant because, again, I was teaching at a majority white high school. But I was hopeful. Maybe they would get something out of this. So, as a class, we analyzed the rhetoric that he used. The song begins with a discussion of his own whiteness in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. He starts off saying, I want to take a stance because we are not free. Then I thought about it, we are not we. They're chanting out Black Lives Matter, but I don't say it back. Is it okay for me to say, I don't know, so I watch and stand? We start with the ethos of this moment, discussing Macklemore's persona, his honesty, and his rawness in this moment. Um, and then he goes on to say, you've exploited and stolen the music, the moment, the magic, the passion, the fashion you toy with. The culture was never yours to make better. You're Miley, you're Elvis, you're Iggy Azalea. We want to dress like, walk like, talk like, dance like, yet we just stand by. We take all we want from Black culture, but will we stand up for Black lives? So in this moment, he's calling on his own whiteness and that of other white artists who have used Black culture to their advantage. My students see this and they start to think more critically about their own use of culture and how they fit into it. Um, I think this particular moment is one of the most impactful in terms of their own lives. But then the most impactful moment of the song itself is right here. So this is the moment that really makes them pause and think about their own interactions and their own connection to their ethnicity. Um, my white students really think about how do I interact with the police? How do I, um, how are my interactions different than other people's interactions? And this moment is not just um, analyzing the rhetoric of the song, but it's also analyzing their own personal connection. Um, so at the end of the semester, one of my students said, Macklemore's song helped me learn Aristotle's appeals easier because it was something current that I could relate to. And another said, it made me think about my own life, and that helped me realize how rhetoric and persuasion works in everything. A third one says, I really only viewed it as music normally, jamming with people when driving, but doing an intense explanation on those made me understand the insights and the discussion of how different people think. So, the first time I taught this song, like I said, I was a new teacher trying to find my pedagogical footing. Um, but after that semester, and after reading their comments, I started to realize not only can I dig into the text and the ideas, but I should, so that I can show them, first of all, what a rhetorical analysis is and what it's good for. But second of all, so I can show them how to be critically aware citizens. So I started to bring in more and more texts that dealt with race, that dealt with this same subject matter. And I started to realize that my students were interacting with the hip hop much more than they were interacting with any other um, text that I brought in. And that's because for our generation, or for the next generation, I should say, hip hop acts as literature. It uses these rhetorical strategies and these techniques to really get across its argument and its message. So, bringing it to students and studying it as literature really helps them recognize the value in learning about literature and rhetoric, while also serving to provide confirmation that their culture is valid. Academia often doesn't value um, popular culture. It doesn't value the things that students find interesting or intriguing. Um, Much like back in the day, it didn't value Emily Dickinson or Zora Neale Hurston. Yet now, these people are vital to the American canon. We can't imagine American canon without Dickinson or Hurston. And so these artists may be the next addition to the American canon. Um, and showing students that we are interested in their culture really helps them gain insight into their own lives and into their own culture. Um, so researchers Shawanda Stewart and Brian J. Stone say using hip hop as content for a course and centering students themselves as sources of knowledge shows those students diverse language varieties, cultures, and rhetorical practices are relevant resources for an academic setting. Students develop an understanding of the relationship between language and culture, which encourages them to take the lessons they learn in class to their everyday lives. They say that using a hip hop centered pedagogy in the rhetoric classroom has resulted in increased student engagement and a heightened sense of academic self efficacy. Really, that just means that it helps students realize that their interests are important and that they can continue on and actually enjoy learning. Um, so, in my experience, white students who have been asked to be critically aware and to interact with hip hop, with Black Lives Matter, in ways that they haven't before. So, in my classroom, I'm using process pedagogy to bring their experiences to the forefront, But I'm also using reality pedagogy beyond merely the cosmopolitan aspect that I mentioned before to create a classroom that is both welcoming to all and cultivates a critically aware student population. So not only am I asking them to engage with something in maybe a way they haven't before, but I'm asking them to engage with it as themselves, not just as students. So, according to Christopher Emden, reality pedagogy is an approach to teaching and learning that has a primary goal of meeting each student on his or her own cultural and emotional turf. It focuses on making the local experiences of the student visible. Reality pedagogy, I think, works especially well when dealing with students who are non white or non traditional. That means older. So, as Emden and others have theorized, reality pedagogy is useful in bridging the gap between white educators and non white students, consciously bringing the white educator to the level of non white students rather than forcing non white students to leap into the white educator's realm. I think this is especially useful in attempting to shift the burden of understanding from the non white students onto the white educator. Um, But when we're talking about students who are white and young, so what we would traditionally think of as a college student, they're used to their experiences being in the middle or being centered. They're used to their educators looking like they do. They're used to their likeness being at the center of their learning. So for them, reality pedagogy has to work harder. Um, if we want to deal with race, we have to deliberately engage race to bring racial experiences to the forefront of their thinking. Students who don't have to grapple with race in their everyday lives are unlikely to do so, and even the most critically conscious classroom. It's just not on their radar. That's why they receive the wrong message when they hear Black Lives Matter. I don't think they're being deliberately obtuse. They're just processing the information from their own perceptions. Um, And I think that students who don't have to be conscious of race lack the learned experiences to understand. And so that's where bringing empathy in and modeling empathy and teaching them to try to understand really engages them in the classroom. Um, Knowledge acquisition involves taking new information into our working memory and then converting it to long term memory by connecting it by association to something already in long term memory. That means that our brains process information super slowly. Um, so, because of that, new information has to be approached in such a way as to make it meaningful. Nicholas Carr says working memory is the scratch pad of consciousness, while long term memory is the mind's filing system. Because working memory is so sparse, we can only store 2 to 4 pieces of new information at a time. And it's so easy to shatter our focus and lose all of that. So, to make that process easier, our brain develops routines that help us shorten the process of converting material from short term or from working memory to long term memory. Because of that, our brains don't process all information equally. It's just not possible. We have memories and previous knowledge through which new information is filtered. That means that the same information given to two people is processed in two different ways. So while the fact might be the same, the emotion and knowledge connected to it is not. So when someone whose long term memory says race matters, Black Lives Matter sounds like Black Lives Matter also. But when someone whose long term memory says race doesn't affect them, here's Black Lives Matter, they hear Black Lives Matter more. And that's why working with process in an empathetic classroom is so important. Listening to Macklemore's White Privilege 2 helps students grapple with the idea of white privilege and Black Lives Matter as ideas to consider critically rather than ideas they need to react to. Teachers Chris Burnham and Rebecca Powell say writing is more than the product of communication. It is a means for making meaning, and creating identity. So having students listen to this song, then think about it in terms of their own lives helps them understand the ideas presented. In fact, about a year ago, one of my students told me, I came from India as a kid, and hip hop helped me adjust to the society around me. It was the way I was able to connect with others. It helped me to initiate conversation because it was all over the radio. So this student is interacting with the ideas and initiating conversation. He's doing exactly what I hope to accomplish. I want my students to be able to analyze their world and connect with other people using those pieces of the world that they analyze. Using hip hop in the classroom has interested my students and made them pay more attention and actually interact with the assignment, which is always a challenge. So Nick Shulo says students are more likely to share in class when they feel as though the lessons impact their daily lives. Seeing and hearing rhetoric and hip hop provides that connection. Knowing this firsthand after seeing the engagement with Macklemore and recognizing the need to engage race more, I added more hip hop to my class. This time, though, I wanted to put my activism where my mouth was. Analyzing Macklemore's songs semester after semester made me realize I need to do more. I'm a white teacher. We already had a white artist we are analyzing, and many of my students are white, or at least non Black. There's a large Asian population at both the schools I teach at. But we're talking about Black lives, and there's a disconnect there. Um, Macklemore's song ends with Jamila Woods, who is a Black woman. So if silence is a luxury, and Macklemore and other white artists are exploiting that culture, what does my implicit acceptance of him as a representative of hip hop, how is that not hypocritical? So after that, I added Joyner Lucas's I'm Not Racist and Childish Gambino's This Is America. Joyner Lucas's song begins with a white man sharing his arguments, sharing his arguments about why he's not racist.
Black.
And it ends with a Black man. So with this song, I ask students to analyze the arguments that are being presented, both explicit and implicit. This one is a little bit more sensitive, so I use Peter Elbow's idea of free writing to help them kind of work out their thoughts. With free writing, students are asked to write for 10 minutes straight without stopping. In the context of this song, I ask them to think about the message and write. It doesn't matter what they write as long as they don't stop. As a class, we discuss the juxtaposition of the two men. We talk about the stereotypes. We talk about the arguments. The Macklemore song makes my students think of race in terms of white privilege, challenging their ideals and views of whiteness from the inside, while Joyner Lucas's video makes them think about the issues in terms of Blackness and stereotypes. To quote Nick Shulo again, hip hop effectively demonstrates the importance of Aristotle's proofs to today's undergraduates. When they learn to critically analyze the arguments they are presented with daily, they are more engaged in class, in learning, and in retaining the ideas. This semester, when I taught the Macklemore song, my high school students reacted much as my college students have. They loved it. They had not heard this song before, but they knew who Macklemore was. They liked his music. And so that helped automatically give them an in to trying to understand where he's coming from because they already know who he is. They already know the style of song. They said that this song was aimed at their generation and my generation, a millennial, giving us specific and well written arguments to analyze. They also said that it helped them recognize why analysis is so important. We're not talking about, you know, eating babies in 1700s Ireland like Jonathan Swift. We're not talking about dreaming about better days for our children in 1960s America like Martin Luther King Jr. We're talking about white privilege in the year 2016, which is something that they can relate to. The other things they can see are important, but they don't really have any sense of immediacy. That idea of immediacy is what makes using hip hop in my classroom so important. I want them to be able to take these lessons into their daily lives. I know that that's probably asking a bit much for most of them, but if I can reach a few every semester and help them recognize the value of critical thinking and analysis, I think I've done my job. In order to do this, much like Alana said, I try to facilitate rather than lecture. I lead discussions, but they have to discuss. At first, I was a lecturer. I spoke at my students. The first time I did this Macklemore exercise back in 2015, I told them what to see. I showed them what was happening. I explained how things worked in the song. Instead of letting them work it out on their own, I showed them my point. Um, Instead of really showing them what I wanted to show them, I think I alienated them. But as I grew as a teacher, I learned to kind of let go and let them assess a piece on their own before I give them my input, if I give it at all. This way, they interact with the ideas. They learn to search for pieces themselves. They learn to break things apart themselves. And that's been incredibly useful. One semester, I had a student recognize the drums that Macklemore used as coming from a specific place in Africa. Um, so once I learned to really embrace that cosmopolitan, empathetic classroom in which students are also the teachers, they started learning more, and we all became more critically aware citizens. Last semester, I had a student tell me the pop culture gave us a bit more knowledge of the context surrounding the pieces, but sometimes I also felt a bit uncomfortable trying to analyze topics that are still so sensitive. It almost distracted me thinking about the subject the piece was talking about rather than what the piece said about the subject itself. This might be considered a win for the piece in making me think about the subject. I was also constantly questioning whether my analysis and notes were objective or just biased. And that's my point. That is my purpose, is helping students recognize their own inherent biases. So, in short, using these songs has challenged both me and my students to think more critically and to alter our viewpoints. I wanted them to learn to see their world in a new way. And I think ultimately they do. Nick Shulo again says it behooves educators to consider how hip hop can help today's students understand classical rhetoric. I agree. I think that we need to use what is popular to engage students' minds in deeper ways. Not only have my students learned to challenge their own views on race, but they have also learned and interacted with Aristotle's appeals from 3,000 years ago more fully so that they actually use them outside of the class now. Stewart and Stone discovered that using a pedagogy specific to hip hop in the rhetoric classroom improves student understanding and usage of rhetoric both in and beyond the classroom. Other researchers have called for this specific type of pedagogy as well. I'm adding my voice to this call. We need to challenge accepted literary examples and bring in examples students can relate to in order to improve their understanding and usage of rhetoric and argumentation. One more quote from a student who explained it the best. Hip hop helped tie everything we were learning into real life. Junior year English class, we covered rhetoric for a large part of the year. We read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, watched and analyzed old speeches and everything. Don't get me wrong, Frederick Douglass's autobiography is amazing and an excellent source for plenty of rhetorical devices, but it isn't something any of us can understand and very few can relate. Remember, this is a majority white high school. Joyner Lucas's I'm Not Racist and Childish Gambino's This Is America helped me connect a lot to understanding rhetoric. I think you hit a good middle ground between pop culture that's relevant and historical works that, I'm going to be honest, a lot of people don't care about. Yes, these works were and are very important and well written, but it's harder to connect with, especially in high volume. Macklemore says hip hop has always been political. It's the reason this music connects. And faults a Nigerian rapper who modeled his song This Is Nigeria after Childish Gambino's This Is America, says the primary motivation was to trigger an awakening. So I agree. Let's be political. Let's stop tacitly approving the status quo. We need to trigger an awakening in our students. And that is me. And now it is Sunny's turn.
Yes. Hi there. I am Sunny Williams. I am also a PhD student here at UT Dallas, and I'm pursuing my PhD in philosophy, though I have a very extensive literature background. So just like Chris and Alana, I teach rhetoric here at the university. My background is mostly in literary theory, and of course, now as a philosopher, I am more into the theory than the praxis at this point, though the praxis, of course, is very important. Like Chris, I teach with popular culture. I teach Aristotelian ethics through This Is America, Eminem, Taylor Swift, a speech from one of the X-Men movies. So I find as well that really helps them connect because they've seen it already in many cases, and they think about it differently when they're looking for ethos, pathos, and logos, for instance. So my presentation here is on a theory that I am currently developing called sodalism. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see. Can y'all see that? Some nods. Awesome. All right.
Yes, we can.
So, thank you very much. So yes, my contribution is teaching sodalism as a path to rejecting whiteness. So like Chris says, I feel like one of the most important things as a teacher is to awaken my students, to show them things they haven't seen before. The philosopher's task is to help develop an adequate conceptual repertoire and to advocate for the future. So how should whiteness adapt? Like Chris and Alana, I am teaching a varied group of students, but I still feel like it's very important to teach whiteness and white privilege because, as my presentation will show, all of our identities are constructed from whiteness, whether it's in opposition to or aligned with. And it's an important way that we navigate our world. Let's see. Hey, there we go. So what is whiteness? So in The Future of Whiteness, Linda Martin Alcoff says that it's a social and historical identity. But in The Souls of White Folk, Du Bois laments that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen. Very strong and important statement. Of course, whiteness is both of these things. Through identity and ideology, whiteness has founded our social and political landscape. It is becoming global. It is reaching every area of the world, especially now that we have social media and the technology that we use every day. And that has created a power structure that is upholding and perpetuating whiteness. And of course, whiteness benefits white people and it marginalizes non-white people socially, politically, economically, personally. Their identities are functioning from whiteness. So what is sodalism? It's a word that I've created from the Latin word sodalus, and this word means accomplice, conspirator, which is the most important word for our purposes here today, but also I want to emphasize that it also means companion, intimate, comrade, crony, mate, friend. It's going to be something similar to allyship, but we'll talk about that as we go too. So sodalism is something I'm presenting as an open worldview. And the reason that I use the word open is because worldviews should be something that we have, but that we understand needs to constantly adjust and change as we progress. So with that in mind, it is a worldview that wants the future and goes towards the future. So someone who identifies as a sodalist will commit to maintaining an awareness of systems of whiteness and power. So we'll talk more about that. The ways in which those systems affect themselves and others and construct their identities and their social environments. They will commit to decolonizing their mind through ongoing self-reflection to determine personal privilege and bias. This is something that they would do in a class like Chris's, for instance, thinking about their own perceptions. They commit to acknowledging the phenomenological experiences of those in marginalized groups. Now, even though sodalism is looking at the communion of us all, it's very important that it's also looking at all of the different ways we experience the world, and that those who are experiencing in opposition to whiteness are having very different and very sometimes damaging experiences. The sodalist also commits to refraining from totality by making visible and celebrating a plurality of identities and experiences. So it's not an essentialist view. It doesn't think that we all have an essence that's the same. It thinks that we all have an origin that's the same. And that is the origin of being earthlings, human beings on this earth together. A sodalist commits to understanding that equality does not negate difference and difference does not condone hierarchy. A sodalist commits to co-conspiring towards rejecting and dismantling social and political systems of whiteness that harm those relegated as others via these systems. This idea of co-conspiratorship is what is kind of taking over allyship, in that we are now a very active group of people. There needs to be action. There needs to be more, as Chris said. A sodalist finally commits to ideas of deep ecology that establish all earthlings as intimate companions in fellowship with each other and our earth. So we'll get to a little more of that as we go as well. So why is being an ally not enough? Well, allyship hasn't made a huge epistemic change yet. And the reason for that is that allyship works from identity. So someone who identifies as white is now in opposition to someone who does not identify as white. Allyship functions within that. Sodalism functions in a, well, with that difference in mind, obviously, but from an idea that we all have this cosmic ecological story that we share. So sodalism reveals identity as a construct. And when you are a white person who understands that your identity is a construct of whiteness, and so is a person who is a marginalized person, you understand that both identities are constructs. Identity is no longer a place where hatred can grow, because you understand that both of them are illusions. It's just that the illusion is harming someone else and it's not harming you. And therefore, you as a white person have a responsibility to help dismantle those systems. So Allies are situated within whiteness with a focus on actively working to make white spaces safer, whereas sodalists recognize that they are situated within whiteness, but it is a construct, and that construct subjugates others. So we will still actively work to dismantle white spaces as opposed to letting other people in. They shouldn't exist as white spaces at all. They should exist as spaces for everyone. So instead, we would rebuild egalitarian spaces that welcome people of all identities. There's a quote here that I'm going to use from Alcoff again. Whites who take up the challenge of ending the spread of white supremacist ideas and eroding the white material advantages still accruing from the slavery and colonialism are incorrectly understood to be allies. They are activists in their own right, coming into the movement in two ways. First, as human beings, fellow human beings, and second, as white people who refuse to perpetuate the practice of white support of and apathy toward the oppression of non-white people. So there you see the difference between allyship and sodalism. So now we want to look at identity as an illusion, as a construct. In revealing whiteness, Sullivan notes that these institutions are so able to effectively perpetuate and continue whiteness because whiteness becomes a part of identity. You attach yourself as an individual and you commit yourself to whiteness. That is the kind of self-reflection that you want to become aware of and start looking at. In what ways has your identity attached to your whiteness? So Sullivan proposes that these take root in yourself and your identity. Whereas people who have identified as non-white are now still in the same construct as you, but they're getting the negative effects of it. So we all have these diverse and intersectional identities, but they're a product of our social position, where we were born, what we look like, if we are normative or non-normative, cognitively, ably. There are many aspects, and you think about how you identify yourself, all of the labels that you use. I'm a vegan, so that becomes a big part of who I am when I am talking to people about myself. But it is completely a word that it's a new way of life. It's a newer word. It's a social zeitgeist word, right? So if I was just a person who ate plant-based 100 years ago, I wouldn't have that identity. So just to use kind of a little personal tidbit there, obviously my identity, like everyone's, has many, many layers, but I understand that all of it is an illusion. It's not who I am, and it's not who others deem me to be. So this is not to say, of course, that constructed identities don't come with real consequences. Phenomenologically, people are having experiences that are internally and externally very harmful, which is why it's important that we recognize and dismantle these systems. This is an image that I absolutely loved, the other, one on top of the other. So John Cobb says that there's two ways we can see each other. We can see each other as a body, and we can see each other as the subject object, right? So you being the subject, another person being the object. So there's this kind of dualism happening in views of others. But if you start to understand that everyone else is also a subject, everyone else is also experiencing and being constructed, it starts to take away the hold that your idea of identity has on you. Once you realize that your identity is somewhat chosen and somewhat not chosen, but a kind of an amalgamation of these things, you start to understand that other people's identities have created the same stories in their mind, the same narratives. And it really helps you to step away from othering people, thinking of them in opposition to yourself. So I want to start getting into thinking about that idea of ecology. What do we have that we share, that we can hold on to? David Bohm says that the whole universe, in some degree, is connected. Heidegger says this too, but that's such a long story that I won't get into it. But we are enfolded, as Heidegger would say, together, human beings, animals, plants, the entire planet. And when we try to separate ourselves from that ecological viewpoint, we tend to decide that we are separate people, we're individuals with our identities. And the main motivation seems to be regarding other people as what Heidegger would say, standing reserve. What are they there for you? What is the earth there for you? What are other human beings there for you? And when you start to think about the fact that we're all in this ecology together, it helps you to step away from that idea of manipulation. And we'll look at that a little further here. I love this quote from Toni Morrison. My little box has cut off what I can see, so I'm going to read it as best as I can. Hopefully you can see the whole thing. So she's saying, what is the nature of othering comfort? Its allure. Why do we other others? Is it the thrill of belonging? Does it imply something bigger that we're a part of, and therefore we found something stronger because it's a unit? So Morrison says that her initial view leans towards the social psychological need for a stranger. So the self, the identity, looking at an opposition becomes stronger. If you see something that you are not, it solidifies what you are. So what if we're all a part of something bigger? Something that includes all of us, something that will help us feel at home on this earth again. And like there are no strangers and there are no others. There are different experiences, but there are not strangers. So if we recognize that we're enfolded in the world, not just with other people, but nature as a whole, we will feel one with the world and with each other. We will no longer want to manipulate others. We will no longer want to other others, but we'll feel a genuine love for other human beings who are experiencing the same constructs that we're experiencing, and a love for the earth that gives us the oxygen we're breathing right now. It gives us everything to sustain our lives. So Brian Swim does an incredible piece of work on cosmic storytelling. And he says that human beings have a cosmic story that is not tied to one cultural tradition or to a political ideology, but instead it gathers all of us into one meaning as earthlings. He says that we can build our lives and societies around that, the earth story, not the me story, not the you story, not the self story, but the earth story. So ourselves as earthlings. So our destiny becomes intimate communion with all that is. So what's in it for white people? Gloria Anzaldúa invites, early on in her work, Borderlands, she invites white people to join her in what she calls a new mestiza consciousness. Now, mestiza, of course, is a Latin term meaning, and it's feminized, so a Latin woman of mixed race. But the consciousness is what she's speaking of as inviting white people in to learn about her culture, to learn about other cultures. So that's why the three of us teach the way we do, is we teach these other viewpoints, these other cultures, these other ways of being and experiencing and living, and we teach them as valid. We make sure that they are visible to our students. Because sometimes if you are inundated in whiteness, you're not seeing what else is out there, just like Chris mentioned. So I want to talk a little bit about Bob Zellner. He was the first white field secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinate Committee. In the 60s, he was working towards the civil rights movement. And I learned his story from The Future of Whiteness in Al Koff's book. And during his time as an activist, he received death threats. He was assaulted and beaten multiple times by white people. He ended up being arrested, of course, during protests and things of that nature, and in prison was abused by white people. So he said to himself, or, in an interview, he said, I'm not doing this just for Black rights anymore. Now I'm doing it for my rights to be able to believe in equality, because I'm fighting for something that I believe in, and I'm being abused by people who don't agree with me. So this is not only a fight for them, it's a fight for me. And that's something that white people really need to understand. If we do not begin to fight for everyone to be equal, for all of us to join in the world together, we're in trouble because we are becoming a minority, which is a good thing. It's very important that we have a mix of cultures and genes and identities, but we have to make room. White people have to make room because we are currently the dominant culture. Alcoff thinks that that's going to continue for a while. I do not believe it does, or it will. I believe that we need a new worldview that does not position whiteness as dominant. So sodalism is a fight for the right to believe in equality. It's a fight for egalitarian systems and policies and spaces. It's a right to share this earth and to identify with our cosmic story and not with our whiteness. For the white sodalists, this worldview will allow them to finally feel at home on this earth alongside their fellow earthlings. Picture of Bob there. So can white people really change? Alcoff says, although racialized identities are social and historical constructs, the construction of whiteness has taken a specific form that poses unique and daunting challenges for an adaptation to living alongside others in relation to equality. Why would they want to give up their culture, which is the dominant culture that benefits them? Well, I liken it to feminism. Why does a man decide to become a feminist? He's decided that he wants to reject patriarchy and help women dismantle the systems of patriarchy that have harmed them. So in a similar way, a sodalist as a white person wants to reject that whiteness as an epistemic system and work to ameliorate it so that it's better for everyone. I love this Eckhart Tolle quote. The secret to finding the deeper level in the other is finding the deeper level in yourself. Without finding it in yourself, you cannot see it in the other. Once you find it and once you see it, there is no other. So if one acknowledges through sodalism that all identities are constructed illusions, and that we are all earthlings sharing our cosmic story, which is that deeper level that Tolle mentions, it becomes impossible to continue to function from an ideology of whiteness because you become aware of it. Just like in the way we're teaching these cultures, these different pieces of art and literature and music, if our students are thinking about that, it's like something once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's going to always be there. It might be faint, but we're hoping, that's the reason we teach this way, that it gets stronger and stronger, that these ideas become the forefront so that you look out into the world and you see these things instead of seeing from a position of whiteness. So change can occur and habits of resistance can be developed, but only if a person takes responsibility for their unconscious life. Whiteness is often unconscious, and bringing it to awareness, bringing it to the forefront, and making yourself conscious of it is how you can change. So how to teach sodalism? I've got a couple of quotes here. The most important is that Anzaldúa says, whites could allow themselves to share and exchange and learn from us in a respectful way. That is the way that we can move forward as a global society. It's the only way. And Alcoff says that whites should adapt to a multiracial world and society the same way others have, by not assuming a right of presumptive entitlement to political leadership, to cultural domination, to economic prosperity, by learning. In short, to share, to take on the periphery now and again, but most importantly, to learn more about others with whom they cohabit nations. So once you're exposed to other cultures, it's very difficult to retreat back into your own little space of whiteness. So we've seen the theory. In praxis, it's quite similar to what you've heard from Chris and Alana on my part as a teacher anyway. In order to understand whiteness and these structures of power that have created it, and I'm talking about coloniality, panopticism, capitalism, interpolation, all of these ideas that we think of as philosophers and as critical theorists are founded in whiteness. They're Western ideals. And America especially has been, founded on these ideas. So a student who wants to adopt a socialist worldview will study art, music, and texts from people of color, LGBTQIA plus identities, women, other marginalized people. They will study these systems of whiteness. So you'll hear Foucault and Marx and Gramsci, Said, the ideas of Orientalism. They will study and compare individualism from both Western and non-Western standpoints. So it's important to look at the way the Buddhists see the self, right, as a non-entity. They understand that it's construction. And so we need to bring that understanding to the West. And then, of course, as we've seen, the study of ecology and cosmology and that cosmic storytelling. So again, my little boxes are in the way, but Sodalism as a new open worldview. I want to stress that the important part of it for students is learning to examine your own identity as a construct, acknowledging that it's constructed through systems that don't oppress you, but oppress others, and committing to aligning yourself with your fellow earthlings and our earth that we share. So in that way, students will learn by changing their consciousness to act, and then it becomes social activism through rejecting whiteness, working towards shared spaces. For Alcoff, she says the solution lies in facing the truths about who we are, how we got here, and then developing an offensive strategy for achieving a future in which we can find a place. Now, for me, that is the place, Earth, that we all share. Once you realize that you are a part of the place, it gives you a place. And that place puts you on equal ground with someone that you originally saw as the other, while still acknowledging that they've had different experiences, of course. So yes, I think that's it from me. Click to exit. Here we go. All right, so I will stop sharing and hand it back over to our moderator, Chris.
All right. So I think we might be about out of time. I think we all kind of went a little bit over, me especially probably. But does anyone have any questions? Alana? You unmuted.
Yes.
You unmuted. Do you have questions?
I guess not a question. I'm probably going to become that person, but I just find it interesting how both of you are braver than I am in terms of especially discussing things like race and politics in your classrooms.
But that's because we're white. We can.
Yeah, it's our responsibility to. But yeah, I think that we can get away with more.
I shy away from talking about LGBT things in my classroom, though, because I am a lesbian. So I think because we are not marginalized and because we are white, we have the opportunity, and it's not going to look like we're just on a soapbox.
Yeah.
I have had a student say that my class was too political, but it's like Chris said, we need that, our world is political. So if we're teaching people to negotiate and navigate their worlds, that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, and I think especially we're not in rural Texas, but Texas at all, I think that it is our responsibility. And like Alana said, you didn't develop this system, you haven't benefited from it. Sunny and I have benefited from it. Even, we didn't create the system, but we have benefited from it. And so it is incumbent upon us to help tear it down.
Yeah.
As those who benefit from it, it is our job to help break it apart.
Mhm.
And then like just it's kind of interesting how just in terms of me being alienated by academia has kind of been a major reason why I want to be as inclusive as I can to not alienate others. And so it sounds like you guys kind of had the same sort of experiences just in terms of feeling on the outside looking into something and then channeling that to make sure that the generation that's coming up now doesn't necessarily have to deal with that in the same way as we have. So I find that interesting, but like I said, it was like it would be nice to be able to do stuff like y'all have done without feeling like, oh my gosh, like I can't do this. It'll be a black person pulling the race card or
Yeah.
something of that nature. So
Mhm.
there's a very fine balance that they truly don't teach us how to do.
Definitely
It's
not.
just
Well,
something that we have to try to
Yeah, we just
figure out.
and
So.
none of this is anything that we were taught. I mean, I know that all three of us just kind of developed these things on our own. And so I think us being able to do this panel together really um, helps to show that we're not alone, I guess, in our feelings, but also that hopefully to give other people hope that they're also not alone in trying to develop um, things like this and trying to help students recognize that they are also not necessarily on the outskirts. And I'm just gonna stop.
yeah, no, that's
Yeah,
all
so I guess
great.
yeah, so yeah, I would say like my major question is we've been blessed to be at UTD where things are so diverse, not just racially, but gender identity, sexual identity, things of that nature. How do we take what we've been able to do here, where we go from here? I guess it's one of my major concerns because this is the first time I've been around more than just maybe one or two other minorities and then all white people. But I'm most likely going back into that atmosphere
Hmm.
depending on where I end up landing a job. So how do we kind of keep the same energy that we have now in this nice, cushy position that we're in now? But how do we continue this where we might end up having more backlash and less diversity and less acceptance and a less welcome nature in general? Because
Yeah.
I can't figure it out.
And I wondered that about what Sunny was saying as well. How realistic is this for us to continue? And how realistic is it to take the idea of sodalism and the idea of dismantling whiteness for those who benefit from it um, outside of academia?
Well, and taking my inspiration from the history of feminism, um, I feel, I guess, similar in that as a woman, I feel, oh, can I talk about feminism without, you know, seeming like a woman talking about feminism, which is what I am, but,
Hmm.
culturally. Um, Feminism, of course, was very, especially like the suffragette movement, for instance. The suffragettes were in the streets, breaking windows, protesting, being arrested, being beaten. And it really reminds me, of course, of what we're going through today with the racial progress we're trying to make. So I try to tell myself that feminism made strides. Obviously, we still have strides to make,
Hmm.
but it has made such a huge leap in equality, that I hope that now that we're seeing such a similar move towards racial equality, that we will start seeing that. There's always the fear that it isn't realistic, because look at the 60s when we did have that press for it, and it was smothered, it was suffocated. And now we're trying to do it again. And there's always that fear that it's not going to work. But eventually, our generation, and I don't know if y'all feel the same way, but the students that I'm teaching are very aware of racial issues, and they're very aware of climate issues, and they're very aware of issues with equal with sexuality and identities like that. So I have hope that our generation and the generations behind us are moving towards worldviews like sodalism, where we're so connected with media that it's hard you can't hide in your whiteness the way you used to be able to. I know there are people trying, but we're not going to let them.
Is it a pendulum? Like you mentioned, the 60s, we did a wide swing, and then we swung the other direction. And now we're swinging back again, to have a token win. Maybe Derek Chauvin is a token. Are we going to keep seeing wins like that? Or is that going to be the one that's held on a pedestal, and then we'll just go back to status quo?
Yeah, I don't call that a win.
No,
because we had to lose in order,
of course,
to make that happen. And I know that's not how you were coming from that. It's just that I still can't really figure out if it's just happening more or if we're just happening hearing about it more. So I can't really logically figure out, oh, we've gotten better, because how can you quantify that when I would assume for every one person that we hear about, or every one person whose death I get to see over and over again on Twitter, there's at least 10 other people who weren't videoed in their last moments, or who didn't have people with body cams or cell phones or anything like that. So how do we say oh, it's I feel like the pendulum from the 60s has swung really right in the 80s, even though it's kind of coming back. It has not swung all the way. We're still kind of just teetering on this little one side, and I feel like we might end up going back fully to the right depending on these next few years and this next election. So I can't say I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful, but I can't be optimistic anymore because 2016 took too much out of me for me to really ever be optimistic about a lot anymore.
I do think that social media has helped, at least to make us more aware of it. If not, like you said, for every one, there's probably 10. But think about Emmett Till. For every one Emmett Till, there were thousands. So at least maybe we're more aware, and then we can access that space that Sunny's talking about, where we maybe recognize that it needs to change, and we can start the process of changing. And you're right, it's not a win. It's not even really progress necessarily, but it may be a half step in the direction of progress.
Well, philosophically, there's definitely what we would call progress, in that there was a very long period of American history, especially, of color blindness, where we're not talking about race, but race is obviously still functioning under everything, right? So now we're talking about it. So there is a lot of philosophers say that is a step in the right direction. Even people who don't agree in equality are thinking about and talking about race. So it's back in the, I don't want to say the zeitgeist, because that's not the right, but it's everywhere we turn. now.
Cultural
And it should
awareness.
be our cultural awareness. Thank you. Yeah. So people are having to self-reflect to an extent to decide, I am a racist or I'm not a racist, right? And if I'm not, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do about this still happening? So yeah, I think that there's something to be said for that. Can we go back to can the pendulum swing and we go back to a color blindness? Possibly, but I feel like these students that I'm teaching are not gonna, they have opinions and they're not, we're not silenced the way we used to be because of social media, I think, but also because everyone is, it reminds me of that Eminem line where the opinions, everybody has,
Yeah.
and everybody has one that is now validated in many ways too by other people around them or whatever it is. But it's certainly, go ahead.
I always try to think of my DJT student, my DJT. I always try to think of him in terms of where are we going and what can we do to fix things? Because I know if he were to watch your presentation about sodalism, one, you would have just glazed him over. He would not have paid attention in the slightest. But two, I think that even if you had somehow gotten something across to him, he would say, I don't need to. I'm not racist, and so I do think, we can do our best, and all we can do is try and approach them. And I do think that more and more of my students, like you're saying, more and more of them are aware of racial issues, of climate issues, of gender issues. But then there's always that one, just that one.
Well, there's more and more people identifying as gender or sexually fluid in some way. So we're getting more people who are comfortable identifying with very marginalized identities, right? So I think that helps people to think about race in a different way too, because you can look at, it's clearly not the same, but it's certainly a level of experience that you can start thinking about in that way. It is much more difficult to reach like a heteronormative white male because they don't have any layers of what philosophy calls blackness. So, and by that I mean a Black woman who is a lesbian, right, would have 3 layers of blackness, otherness, right? And a white male has no otherness. So they're the hardest to reach, but the most important, they're in power. Mm-hmm. So that's where we find ourselves, how do we reach those guys?
Yeah, and I think that aspect of empathy that I was bringing up really speaks to what both of you have been talking about in reaching students who have been othered, who have been marginalized in some way, because I think bringing up empathy in terms of your own self-reflection, and you want people to feel empathy for this situation that you are going through, I think helps to show them that they need to have empathy for others as well. Like you said initially when we first started the Q&A session, Alana, you said we all have had some kind of aspect of otherness, even though Sunny and I are both white. And so clearly our sense of otherness can't compare. We have no, well, you shouldn't compare anyway, but we have no understanding of that double consciousness idea that you must have, but we do have some sense of otherness or a difference, some sense of difference from heteronormative white male 1%, whatever. And so I think bringing in those aspects of identity can help our students really understand and try to relate instead of focusing on just feel bad for me,
Yeah.
are we about done, I think?
Yeah, I think that's a
haven't
nice way
talked
to end it.
All right. Well, thank
Because
you
it
guys.
ends in like a more optimistic tone. So yeah.
I hope we can make something happen. You know, we're young. We're young. Our students are young. We've got the rest of the world to conquer. So
Yeah,
let's try.
let's try. I mean, by the time we're, our students are our age, there will be, eternal life or something.
I'm not that old.
No, I'm just saying how fast things progress.
Oh. All right. Well,
Technologically speaking.
thank you guys for joining me on this panel, and audience, thank you so much for watching.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Now I need to figure out how to